I'm Margaret Thompson, 52 years old, and I never thought I'd be sitting in an emergency room with second-degree burns on my face from chicken noodle soup. The antiseptic smell mixed with the lingering scent of lunch made my stomach turn as the nurse applied cool compresses to my blistered cheek. But what hurt more than the physical pain was seeing my own son David standing beside my hospital bed, arms crossed, saying the words that would change everything between us forever. "Mom, you brought this on yourself." That's when I knew I was done being the victim. Before I tell you exactly how I got my revenge and rebuilt my entire life, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever dealt with toxic in-laws, hit that like button because this story is going to show you exactly what happens when a mother finally stops taking abuse. Don't forget to subscribe because what I did next will completely shock you, and trust me, you won't want to miss how this all unfolds. 8 years ago, when my husband Robert died suddenly from a massive stroke, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me had already occurred. I was wrong. Robert had been my rock, my partner in raising David, and when he passed away at just 45, I found myself a widow facing an uncertain future. David was 19 then, halfway through his sophomore year at Northwestern University, and I made the decision that would later come back to haunt me. I cashed in my retirement savings, sold our family car, and took on 3 part-time jobs to keep him in school. I wanted him to have every opportunity his father and I had dreamed of giving him. For the next 4 years, I lived on ramen noodles and hope, watching my son graduate with honors in business administration. I was so proud when he landed a job at a prestigious consulting firm in Chicago. What I didn't expect was for him to fall head over heels for Ashley Westbrook, the daughter of one of the firm's biggest clients. Ashley was beautiful, educated, and came from the kind of old money family that had country club memberships dating back 3 generations. Her mother, Helena Westbrook, was everything I wasn't: polished, powerful, and utterly convinced that I was beneath her family's standards. The first time I met Helena was at David and Ashley's engagement party 2 years ago. She looked me up and down like I was something unpleasant she'd stepped in, taking in my discount store dress and my nervous smile. "So you're David's mother," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that comes from a lifetime of looking down on people. "Ashley has told me so much about your circumstances." The way she said circumstances made it sound like a disease. I tried to make conversation, mentioning how proud I was of David's success, but Helena cut me off mid-sentence. "Yes, well, children often rise above their origins when given proper guidance." That should have been my first warning, but I was so desperate to be accepted by David's new family that I ignored every red flag. Helena made it clear from the beginning that she considered me an embarrassment. At family dinners, she would seat me at the far end of the table, sometimes in a chair that wobbled or was noticeably shorter than the others. She'd serve meals that she knew I couldn't eat because of my lactose intolerance, then act surprised when I couldn't finish the cream-heavy pasta or rich desserts. "Oh Margaret, I completely forgot about your dietary restrictions," she'd say with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I suppose you can just eat the bread." David, my own flesh and blood, would sit there and say nothing. When I tried to talk to him about Helena's behavior, he'd brush off my concerns. "Mom, she's just particular about things. You're being too sensitive." Too sensitive. That became his standard response to everything. When Helena made snide comments about my job as a library assistant, I was being too sensitive. When she questioned whether I could afford a decent wedding gift, I was being too sensitive. When she suggested that maybe I shouldn't come to their Christmas celebration because I might feel out of place, David actually agreed with her. The wedding planning was a nightmare that lasted 8 months. Helena took complete control, choosing everything from the flowers to the menu to the guest list. She assigned me exactly 4 invitation slots for my side of the family, while her list included over 100 people. When I mildly suggested that perhaps we could add a few more spots for my college friends or longtime neighbors, Helena laughed. "Oh Margaret, I think 4 is quite generous. We don't want the reception to feel crowded with people who don't quite fit the ambiance we're creating." I spent my life savings on a mother-of-the-groom dress that Helena deemed adequate, and I sat through a wedding ceremony where I felt like an outsider watching my son marry into a family that had made it clear I would never be welcome. During the reception, Helena gave a speech about how Ashley had found such a wonderful man who had overcome so much to become the person he was today. The implication was clear. David had succeeded despite me, not because of anything I had done. But the real betrayal came 3 months after the wedding, when Ashley announced she was pregnant. I was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a grandmother, but Helena immediately set about establishing ground rules for my involvement. I could visit the baby once a month, for no more than 2 hours, and only with advance notice. I couldn't babysit unsupervised, couldn't take the baby out of the house, and certainly couldn't have overnight visits. When I asked David why these restrictions were necessary, he said Ashley and her mother felt it was important to maintain appropriate boundaries. The restrictions Helena imposed felt like prison bars slowly closing around any relationship I might have with my grandchild. Little Emma was born 6 months ago, a beautiful baby girl with David's eyes and Ashley's delicate features. I fell in love with her the moment I held her, but Helena made sure those moments were few and far between. Every visit was supervised, timed, and structured according to Helena's rigid schedule. I couldn't feed Emma, couldn't change her diaper, couldn't even take pictures without permission. But Helena's control went far beyond simple grandparent boundaries. She began a systematic campaign to isolate me from my son's life entirely. It started with small lies, little comments designed to make David question my stability and judgment. She told Ashley that I had seemed confused during my last visit, that I had asked the same questions multiple times and appeared to be forgetting things. This was completely fabricated, but when Ashley mentioned it to David, he became concerned about my mental state. "Mom, are you feeling okay?" he asked during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "Ashley's worried that you might be showing signs of early dementia." I was shocked by the accusation. At 52, I was sharp as ever, still working full-time at the library and managing my own finances without any problems. But Helena's poison was already working its way into my son's mind. The situation escalated when Helena began spreading rumors throughout their social circle about my supposed drinking problem. She told elaborate stories about finding empty wine bottles in my car, about me showing up to family events intoxicated, about concerning phone calls where I slurred my words. None of this was true. I rarely drank more than a glass of wine with dinner, and I had never been intoxicated around David or his family. But Helena was convincing, and her word carried weight in their affluent social circle. Within weeks, I started noticing changes in how people treated me. At the grocery store where I'd shopped for years, the clerk who used to chat with me about my work at the library now avoided eye contact. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had been friendly for over a decade, suddenly became cold and distant. I discovered later that Helena had been making phone calls, expressing concern about my well-being and suggesting that I needed professional help for my addiction issues. The most devastating blow came when Helena convinced David that I was becoming a danger to baby Emma. She claimed that during my last supervised visit, I had nearly dropped the baby because my hands were shaking from alcohol withdrawal. She said I had been erratic and emotional, making inappropriate comments about taking Emma away for quality time. Again, none of this was true, but Helena painted such a vivid picture that David began to believe his mother was genuinely unstable. "Mom, I think you need to take a step back from visiting Emma for a while," David told me during what would be our last normal conversation. "Ashley and Helena are concerned about your behavior, and honestly, so am I. Maybe you should consider getting some help." The way he said, "help," made it clear he was talking about addiction treatment or psychological counseling, not the kind of support a grieving widow might actually need. I tried to defend myself, to explain that everything Helena was saying was false, but David had already made up his mind. "You're being paranoid, Mom. Helena doesn't have any reason to lie about this. She's just looking out for our family's well-being." Our family. The phrase hit me like a physical blow because it was clear that our family no longer included me. I had become an outsider, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. When I persisted in trying to explain Helena's manipulative behavior, David's patience finally snapped. "Enough, Mom. You're starting to sound delusional. Helena is a respected member of this community, and you're a woman who's clearly struggling with some serious issues. Maybe you should focus on getting yourself together instead of making up conspiracy theories about my mother-in-law." That night, I sat in my empty house, surrounded by photo albums full of memories of raising David, and realized that Helena's plan was working perfectly. She was successfully driving a wedge between my son and me, and David was not only allowing it to happen, he was actively participating in it. The boy I had sacrificed everything for, the man I had raised to be compassionate and fair-minded, was choosing to believe the lies of a woman he'd known for 3 years over the mother who had devoted her entire adult life to his happiness and success. Helena's campaign against me reached a new level of cruelty when she decided that simply isolating me from David's family wasn't enough. She wanted me completely removed from their lives, and she was willing to use any means necessary to achieve that goal. I should have seen it coming when she hired a private investigator to follow me, documenting my daily routines and looking for anything that could be twisted into evidence of instability or dangerous behavior. The investigator, a sleazy man named Rick Morrison who specialized in divorce cases and insurance fraud, spent 3 weeks following me to work, to the grocery store, to my weekly book club at the community center. He took photographs of me through telephoto lenses, recorded video of me talking to myself while gardening, which Helena later claimed was evidence of auditory hallucinations, and even went through my garbage looking for empty alcohol bottles that didn't exist. But Helena's masterstroke was technological manipulation that would make any cybercriminal proud. She had somehow gained access to my phone number and email address, and she began creating fake messages that appeared to come from me. She sent threatening text messages to Ashley's phone, disguised as coming from my number, saying things like, "That baby should be with her real grandmother," and, "I know where you live, and I'm watching." She created fake email accounts that looked like mine and sent rambling, incoherent messages to David's work colleagues, making it appear that I was having some kind of mental breakdown. The coup de grace came when Helena used voice cloning technology, which I didn't even know existed at the time, to create fake voicemail messages that sounded exactly like me. These messages, left on Ashley's phone at carefully chosen times, contained threats about taking Emma away, accusations about Ashley being an unfit mother, and increasingly unhinged rants about family loyalty and respect. Helena made sure David heard these messages, and his shock and horror at what he believed was his mother's deteriorating mental state was exactly the reaction she wanted. Within 2 weeks of this manufactured evidence campaign, I found myself served with a restraining order that prohibited me from coming within 500 feet of David, Ashley, Emma, or Helena. The court documents contained a litany of accusations that painted me as an unstable, potentially dangerous individual who posed a threat to a young family. Reading through the legal filing felt surreal, like reading about a completely different person who happened to have my name. The restraining order was accompanied by a formal complaint filed with my employer, the city library system. Helena had crafted a detailed report alleging that I had been using library resources to stalk her family, that I had made threatening phone calls from the library's phone system, and that I had been behaving erratically with library patrons, particularly children. She included doctored photographs that appeared to show me arguing with parents and documented incidents that had never occurred. My supervisor, Linda Martinez, had worked with me for 8 years and knew these allegations were completely out of character, but the library's legal department was concerned about liability issues. They placed me on administrative leave pending a full investigation, which effectively ended my income while Helena's legal team continued to build their case against me. I went from being a respected employee with a spotless record to being a suspected threat who couldn't be trusted around children's books. The isolation was devastating. Unable to contact David, prohibited from seeing my grandchild, and suspended from the job that had been my primary source of social interaction, I found myself spending days alone in my house, wondering how my life had spiraled so completely out of control. Helena had systematically destroyed every support system I had, every connection to the outside world that might have helped me fight back against her lies. But Helena's cruelest tactic was yet to come. She arranged for Dr. Marcus Kellerman, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in court-ordered evaluations, to conduct a psychological assessment that would supposedly determine my fitness for contact with my family. What I didn't know was that Dr. Kellerman was a longtime friend of Helena's family, someone who owed his lucrative private practice to referrals from Helena's wealthy social circle. The evaluation was a 3-hour interrogation designed to make me appear unstable. Dr. Kellerman asked loaded questions about my grief over Robert's death, my financial struggles as a single mother, and my reactions to being cut off from David's family. He twisted every normal emotion, every reasonable response to Helena's campaign of harassment, into symptoms of personality disorders and psychological instability. When I expressed frustration about the false accusations against me, he noted paranoid ideation and persecution complex in his report. When I became emotional talking about missing my grandchild, he documented inappropriate attachment behaviors and boundary violations. His final report recommended that I be prohibited from any contact with my family until I completed intensive psychological treatment, including anger management courses, addiction counseling despite having no substance abuse issues, and ongoing therapy with a court-approved mental health professional. The report gave Helena exactly what she needed: official, professional documentation that I was mentally unfit to be around my own family. The restraining order and psychological evaluation left me feeling completely defeated, but salvation came from an unexpected source. Linda Chen had been my neighbor 15 years ago, before she graduated from law school and built a successful practice specializing in civil rights cases. We had lost touch after she moved to a better neighborhood, but she happened to be driving past my house one afternoon when she saw me sitting on my front porch, clearly in distress. Linda was the kind of lawyer who had built her reputation on taking cases that other attorneys wouldn't touch, fighting for underdogs who had been steamrolled by people with more money and power. She had a particular interest in cases involving elder abuse and family manipulation, having watched her own grandmother become the victim of financial and emotional exploitation by relatives who should have protected her. When I told Linda what had happened, her experienced eye immediately spotted the inconsistencies and red flags that indicated a coordinated harassment campaign. She had seen similar patterns in other cases where wealthy individuals had used the legal system as a weapon against less fortunate family members. The sheer volume and sophistication of the false evidence against me suggested professional-level planning that went far beyond simple family conflict. Linda's first step was to conduct a thorough background investigation into Helena Westbrook's history, something that should have been done before any restraining order was granted. What she discovered was shocking. 22 years ago, Helena had been involved in a complex fraud case involving a real estate investment scheme that had cost dozens of elderly investors their life savings. The charges had been quietly dropped after Helena's family paid substantial settlements to the victims, but the court records still existed for those who knew where to look. More disturbing was the pattern of broken relationships in Helena's wake. Linda found 3 other families where Helena had systematically alienated daughters-in-law from their own relatives using remarkably similar tactics. In each case, young men from modest backgrounds had married Helena's daughters or nieces, and within a few years, those men had completely cut contact with their original families. The mothers and fathers who had raised these men found themselves suddenly branded as unstable, inappropriate, or dangerous based on accusations that followed Helena's established playbook. Linda tracked down 2 of these previous victims, women in their 60s who had been estranged from their sons for years. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar to mine: manufactured evidence, fake psychological evaluations, and family members who had been convinced that their own mothers posed some kind of threat. One woman, Patricia Hendricks, had not spoken to her son in 8 years after Helena orchestrated a campaign that resulted in Patricia being banned from her son's wedding and prohibited from seeing her grandchildren. The breakthrough came when Linda discovered that Helena had made a critical mistake in her campaign against me. The voice cloning technology she had used to create fake voicemails left digital fingerprints that could be traced back to the software program and the device used to create them. Linda hired a forensic audio specialist who was able to prove that the threatening messages supposedly left by me had actually been generated using commercially available voice synthesis software. More importantly, Linda found the smoking gun that would eventually bring Helena's entire scheme crashing down. Security cameras at Ashley's apartment building had recorded Helena entering the building alone on 3 separate occasions when the fake voicemails were left, despite the fact that she later claimed to have been at home during those times. The timestamp data from the building's security system perfectly matched the times when the threatening messages appeared on Ashley's phone. Linda also discovered that Dr. Kellerman's psychological evaluation of me violated several professional standards and legal requirements. He had failed to inform me that he had a personal relationship with Helena's family, which constituted a massive conflict of interest that should have disqualified him from conducting the assessment. Furthermore, his report contained conclusions that weren't supported by the actual test results and interview notes, suggesting that he had written the evaluation to support a predetermined outcome rather than providing an objective professional opinion. Armed with this evidence, Linda filed a motion to dismiss the restraining order and launched a counter-offensive that would expose Helena's web of lies. She also reported Dr. Kellerman to the State Medical Board for ethical violations and filed a complaint with the court about the fraudulent evidence that had been used to obtain the restraining order. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had someone in my corner who understood the magnitude of what I was up against. But Linda warned me that Helena wouldn't go down without a fight, and that the next phase of this battle would likely be even more vicious than what I had already endured. Helena had too much invested in her campaign against me to simply retreat when challenged, and women like her often became most dangerous when cornered. Linda was right to be cautious because Helena's response to our legal challenge would prove just how far she was willing to go to destroy my life. Helena's reaction to Linda's legal challenge was swift and vicious. Rather than retreating in the face of mounting evidence against her, she doubled down on her campaign of destruction with a level of desperation that revealed just how much she had to lose if her lies were exposed. She understood that if I successfully challenged the restraining order and proved her manipulation, it wouldn't just restore my relationship with David. It would expose her as a fraud and potentially lead to criminal charges that could destroy her carefully cultivated reputation. Her first move was to escalate the psychological warfare by targeting Ashley directly. Helena convinced her daughter that I had become even more dangerous since being served with the restraining order, and that my hiring of an attorney was proof that I was planning some kind of elaborate revenge against their family. She painted Linda Chen as a bottom-feeder lawyer who specialized in helping unstable clients harass innocent families, and she fed Ashley a steady stream of fabricated stories about my increasingly erratic behavior. Helena hired additional private investigators to monitor not just me, but also Linda's law office, creating detailed reports about our meetings and attempting to gather intelligence about our legal strategy. She used her social connections to pressure Linda's other clients, suggesting that they might want to reconsider working with an attorney who represented dangerous individuals. Several of Linda's clients received anonymous phone calls warning them about their lawyer's poor judgment and unprofessional associations. But Helena's most devious escalation involved manipulating the healthcare system to further support her narrative about my mental instability. She somehow gained access to my medical records, possibly through a contact at my doctor's office, and used information about my grief counseling after Robert's death to create a false narrative about ongoing mental health issues. She shared selective excerpts from my counseling notes with David and Ashley, presenting them out of context to make my normal grieving process appear like evidence of psychological problems. Helena then took the unprecedented step of arranging for Dr. Kellerman to conduct a second, more comprehensive evaluation that would supposedly provide updated information about my deteriorating mental state. This time, she coached Ashley and David on specific incidents to report, creating a detailed fictional timeline of my allegedly escalating behavior since the restraining order was issued. According to their fabricated accounts, I had been seen parked outside Emma's daycare center, had been making threatening gestures when they drove past my house, and had been asking suspicious questions about their daily routines. The second evaluation was even more damaging than the first because Helena had learned from her previous mistakes. Dr. Kellerman was more careful to cover his tracks, and his report included recommendations for involuntary commitment to a psychiatric facility for comprehensive treatment. Helena's goal was clear. She wanted me institutionalized, removed from the community entirely, so that I could never pose a threat to her control over David's life. David's second and most devastating betrayal came when Linda and I attempted to arrange a meeting where I could present evidence of Helena's manipulation directly to my son. We followed all legal protocols, coordinating through attorneys to ensure that the meeting wouldn't violate the restraining order, and we invited David to bring his own legal representation to ensure he felt protected. It was my chance to show him the voice analysis proving the threats weren't from me, the security camera footage showing Helena's lies about her whereabouts, and the evidence of Dr. Kellerman's ethical violations. But when David arrived at the neutral location, a conference room at Linda's law office, he wasn't there to listen to evidence or consider the possibility that he had been manipulated. Instead, he came armed with a prepared statement that Helena had clearly written for him, accusing me of orchestrating an elaborate harassment campaign designed to force my way back into his life despite the court's clear directive to stay away. "Mom, this has to stop," David said, his voice cold and distant in a way I had never heard before. "Helena showed me the bills for all the private investigators you've hired to stalk our family. She explained how you've been using this lawyer to intimidate and harass us through the legal system. I know about the fake evidence you've created to try to discredit Helena, and I'm disgusted by how far you're willing to go." Every word felt like a physical blow because I could hear Helena's manipulative voice behind every accusation. When Linda tried to show David the actual evidence we had gathered, he refused to look at it, saying that Helena had warned him I would try to present doctored documents and fabricated proof. Helena had inoculated him against the truth by convincing him that anything contradicting her narrative was part of my elaborate deception. David announced that he was filing for a permanent restraining order that would prohibit me from ever contacting him or his family again, and that he was considering relocating to another state to get away from my obsessive behavior. The most crushing moment came when David looked me directly in the eye and said, "You're sick, Mom. Helena is trying to protect our family from you, and I should have listened to her warnings sooner. I don't know who you've become, but the mother who raised me would never have put her own selfish needs ahead of her child's safety and happiness. Helena had successfully convinced my own son that loving him and wanting to be part of his life was a form of mental illness that required professional intervention." As David prepared to leave the meeting, I made one final attempt to reach the boy I had raised, the child who used to come to me with every problem and trust me to make everything better. "David, please, just look at one piece of evidence. Look at the voice analysis that proves those threatening messages weren't from me. That's all I'm asking." But David shook his head with the kind of sad disappointment usually reserved for someone who had repeatedly broken your trust. "Helena told me you'd try to use fake scientific reports to confuse me. I'm not falling for it, Mom. I'm done being manipulated by you." That night, I realized that Helena had achieved something even more devastating than separating me from my grandchild. She had turned my own son into her weapon against me, convincing him that protecting his family required him to treat his mother as an enemy. David wasn't just choosing Helena's version of events over mine. He was actively participating in my persecution, believing himself to be the hero protecting his innocent family from a dangerous woman who happened to be the person who had sacrificed everything to give him the life he now enjoyed. Helena's campaign against me had been escalating for months, but nothing prepared me for the calculated cruelty of what she orchestrated next. She had successfully isolated me from my son, destroyed my reputation in the community, and gotten me suspended from my job, but apparently that wasn't enough. Helena wanted a final, decisive victory that would permanently cement my position as the villain in David's life story, and she was willing to risk everything to achieve it. The setup began with what appeared to be an olive branch. Helena called me directly, which was surprising since she had been communicating exclusively through lawyers for months. Her voice was different, softer and more conciliatory than I had ever heard it. "Margaret, I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about this whole situation between our families," she said, managing to sound genuinely remorseful. "I realize that perhaps I've been too harsh, too protective of Ashley and the baby. Maybe we need to sit down like adults and find a way to resolve this for David's sake." I should have been suspicious of this sudden change in tone, but I was so desperate for any chance to repair the relationship with my son that I was willing to grasp at even the thinnest hope. Helena suggested we meet for lunch at Chez Laurent, an upscale French restaurant downtown where we could have a private conversation without the pressure of family members taking sides. She emphasized that she wanted to discuss ways I might gradually rebuild trust with David and Ashley, possibly even earn limited supervised visits with Emma. The restaurant was Helena's choice, and I should have realized the significance of that. Chez Laurent was the kind of establishment where Helena was known and respected, where the staff would automatically defer to her version of any situation that might arise. She had chosen neutral ground that was actually her territory, a stage where she could control the narrative of whatever she was planning to do to me. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early, nervous but hopeful that this might finally be the beginning of the end of our family's nightmare. Helena arrived exactly on time, impeccably dressed as always, and greeted me with what seemed like genuine warmth. For the first 20 minutes of our conversation, she was almost pleasant, asking about my health, expressing sympathy for the stress I had been under, and even acknowledging that the situation had been difficult for everyone involved. But as the conversation progressed, Helena began subtly steering the discussion toward my supposed shortcomings as a mother and grandmother. She suggested that while she was willing to consider reconciliation, I would need to acknowledge my mistakes and commit to significant changes in my behavior. She wanted me to admit publicly that I had been unstable, to apologize to David and Ashley for my harassment, and to agree to ongoing psychological treatment as a condition for any future contact with Emma. When I tried to explain that I had never done the things she was accusing me of, Helena's mask began to slip. Her voice took on the sharp edge I remembered from our previous encounters, and she began lecturing me about family hierarchy and the importance of knowing my place in David's new life. According to Helena, I needed to accept that Ashley was now the primary woman in David's life, and that my role as his mother was secondary to his wife's needs and preferences. You seem to have this outdated notion that being David's biological mother gives you some kind of special status, Helena said, her eyes growing cold as she spoke. But blood relationships mean nothing if they're toxic and destructive. David has chosen his real family now, and that family doesn't include you unless you can prove you deserve to be included. The conversation took a darker turn when Helena began detailing the specific conditions she expected me to meet before any reconciliation could be considered. I would have to move to a different state to ensure I wasn't a constant reminder of past family problems. I would have to change my last name to avoid any association with David's success story. Most humiliatingly, I would have to write letters to David's colleagues and friends, apologizing for my behavior and explaining that I had been mentally unstable but was now receiving appropriate treatment. As Helena outlined these impossible demands, I realized that this lunch was never intended to be a genuine peace negotiation. It was a final humiliation, an opportunity for Helena to gloat over her complete victory and to make sure I understood just how thoroughly she had destroyed my relationship with my son. She wanted to savor my defeat face to face, to watch me realize that there would be no reconciliation, no way back into David's life, no relationship with my grandchild. The moment that changed everything happened when I finally found the courage to push back against Helena's ultimatums. I may have lost my son, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of grief and growing anger, but I will not apologize for loving him or for wanting to be part of my grandchild's life. You've lied about me, manipulated the legal system, and turned my own child against me, but I will not let you convince me that I'm the villain in this story. Helena's reaction was immediate and shocking. Her face contorted with rage at being challenged, at having her authority questioned by someone she considered beneath her notice. "You stupid, pathetic woman," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Do you really think David would choose you over me? Do you think anyone would believe a bitter old widow over a respected member of this community?" Before I could respond, Helena picked up her bowl of French onion soup, the ceramic container still steaming with hot broth and melted cheese, and threw the contents directly into my face. The scalding liquid hit my left cheek and forehead with a searing pain that made me scream, and as I sat there stunned, trying to process what had just happened, Helena stood up and shouted loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "You deserve this for ruining my daughter's life and terrorizing my family." The timing was perfect, Helena's performance flawless. She had made sure that David was nearby, supposedly arriving for a separate lunch appointment, and he rushed into the dining room just as I was screaming in pain with soup dripping down my face. From his perspective, it looked like I had attacked Helena and she had defended herself, exactly the narrative Helena had planned from the beginning. "Mom, what have you done?" David said, his voice filled with horror and disappointment as he helped Helena to her chair, playing the part of the concerned son-in-law protecting his family from his dangerous mother. "Helena, are you hurt? Should I call the police?" Helena played her role perfectly, trembling and tearful, claiming that I had become violent when she refused to help me violate the restraining order. As restaurant staff called for an ambulance and the police, as I sat there with severe burns forming on my face and David comforting the woman who had just assaulted me, I realized that Helena had orchestrated the perfect final scene in her campaign to destroy me. In front of witnesses, with David present to confirm her story, she had created a situation where I appeared to be the aggressor and she was the innocent victim. The burns on my face would heal, but the damage to any remaining hope of reconciling with my son seemed permanent and complete. Sitting in that emergency room, my face bandaged and my heart broken, I experienced what I can only describe as a complete psychological transformation. The physical pain from the second-degree burns was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of hearing my own son tell the police that he believed his mother had become violent and unstable. But somewhere between the morphine and the antiseptic smell of the hospital, I found something I had lost months ago: my fighting spirit. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the emergency room physician treating my burns, became an unexpected catalyst for this transformation. As she carefully cleaned my wounds and applied specialized dressings, she asked quiet questions about what had happened. When I told her the truth about Helena throwing soup in my face, Dr. Mitchell's expression grew serious. "Margaret, this isn't the first time I've treated injuries allegedly caused by domestic disputes where the victim was blamed for the attack," she said carefully. "Have you considered that you might be dealing with someone who has done this before?" Dr. Mitchell's words sparked something crucial: the realization that I had been approaching this situation all wrong. Instead of trying to defend myself against Helena's lies, instead of attempting to convince David of the truth through emotional appeals, I needed to understand that I was dealing with a practiced predator who had refined her techniques through previous victims. This wasn't personal animosity, it was a calculated campaign by someone who specialized in family destruction. Linda Chen arrived at the hospital within an hour of my call, and she brought reinforcements. Dr. Mitchell had recommended we contact Detective Maria Santos, a specialist in elder abuse and domestic manipulation cases who had developed expertise in complex family fraud situations. Detective Santos took one look at the pattern of evidence we had compiled and immediately recognized the sophisticated nature of Helena's operation. "Mrs. Thompson, what you've described isn't random family conflict," Detective Santos explained as she reviewed our files. "This is a systematic campaign of psychological and legal abuse that follows established patterns used by individuals who make a practice of manipulating family structures for personal gain. The level of planning and coordination suggests someone with experience in these tactics." Over the next 48 hours, while I recovered from my injuries, Linda and Detective Santos conducted the kind of comprehensive investigation that should have been done months earlier. They discovered that Helena Westbrook wasn't just a wealthy socialite with a nasty personality, she was a woman with a 20-year history of using manipulation and fraud to maintain control over her family's relationships and finances. The breakthrough came when Detective Santos connected with investigators in 3 other states where Helena had previously lived. Each location revealed similar patterns: young men from modest backgrounds who married into Helena's extended family, followed by the systematic alienation of those men from their original families. In 2 cases, Helena had actually gained legal guardianship over adult children by convincing courts that their biological parents were unfit or dangerous. Most shocking was the discovery that Helena's current wealth didn't come from inherited family money, as she claimed, but from a complex insurance fraud scheme she had orchestrated 15 years earlier. She had arranged for her first husband to have a fatal accident while hiking, collected a substantial life insurance payout, and used that money to establish the social connections and financial resources that enabled her current lifestyle. The case had been investigated but never prosecuted due to lack of evidence, but the suspicious circumstances were well documented. Linda also uncovered evidence that Helena had been financially exploiting Ashley's inheritance from her grandmother. Ashley's trust fund, which should have been worth over $800,000, had been systematically drained through Helena's management, with the money redirected to Helena's personal accounts. Helena had been using forged documents and fake investment reports to hide the theft, but a forensic accountant was able to trace the missing funds. Armed with this information, I finally understood the real reason behind Helena's campaign against me. It wasn't just about controlling David or protecting her daughter from outside influence. Helena needed to maintain absolute control over her family's relationships because her entire lifestyle was built on financial and emotional manipulation that required isolation and dependence. My presence in David's life represented a threat to the closed system Helena had created, a potential source of outside perspective that might expose her various frauds and manipulations. But the most crucial discovery came when Detective Santos located Patricia Hendricks and Ellen Morrison, two other mothers who had been victimized by Helena's tactics in previous cities. Patricia had lost contact with her son 8 years ago after Helena convinced him that his mother was mentally ill and dangerous to his children. Ellen's situation was even more tragic. Her son had completely changed his identity and moved across the country to escape what Helena had convinced him was his mother's obsessive stalking. Both women had tried to fight Helena's accusations through the legal system, but they had been isolated individuals going up against a woman with substantial resources and a network of corrupt professional connections. Patricia had spent her entire savings on legal fees before giving up, and Ellen had actually been briefly institutionalized based on a psychological evaluation that was later revealed to be fraudulent. Meeting these other victims was both heartbreaking and empowering. For the first time, I understood that David's rejection of me wasn't evidence of my failure as a mother, it was proof of Helena's skill as a manipulator. These other women were intelligent, loving mothers who had been systematically destroyed by the same tactics Helena was using against me. But they had also proven that Helena could be defeated if someone had the right resources and strategic approach. Patricia and Ellen became crucial allies in what we began calling Operation Truth Recovery. They provided detailed testimony about Helena's methods, identified her network of corrupt professionals, and helped us understand the psychological techniques she used to turn children against their parents. Most importantly, they had maintained detailed records of their experiences, creating a comprehensive database of Helena's crimes across multiple jurisdictions. Dr. Mitchell also proved to be more than just a treating physician. She had been researching patterns of elder abuse and family manipulation for her doctoral dissertation, and Helena's case provided an almost textbook example of the sophisticated psychological warfare tactics used by domestic predators. Dr. Mitchell's academic credentials gave weight to our accusations and provided a professional framework for understanding Helena's behavior that would be credible to courts and law enforcement. The plan we developed over the following months was comprehensive, methodical, and designed to use Helena's own tactics against her. We called it Operation Mirror because our goal was to reflect back at Helena every manipulation she had used against her victims, but this time with truth instead of lies supporting the accusations. Linda Chen coordinated with law enforcement agencies in 4 states to build a massive case encompassing wire fraud, identity theft, insurance fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy charges that would ensure Helena faced serious prison time. Detective Santos worked with federal investigators to examine Helena's financial transactions, revealing a complex money laundering operation that had been funding her lifestyle for years. But the most satisfying aspect of our plan was the psychological component designed by Dr. Mitchell. Instead of trying to convince David of Helena's guilt through direct confrontation, which Helena had trained him to resist, we would allow Helena to destroy her own credibility through her predictable responses to pressure. The first phase involved Patricia and Ellen filing civil lawsuits against Helena in their respective states, forcing Helena to defend herself against accusations from multiple victims simultaneously. Each lawsuit included detailed documentation of Helena's methods, creating a public record of her pattern of behavior that couldn't be dismissed as the ravings of a single disgruntled family member. While Helena was distracted by these legal challenges, Linda filed motions to have my restraining order dismissed based on the fraudulent evidence used to obtain it. We also reported Dr. Kellerman to multiple professional licensing boards, armed with evidence of his corrupt practices in several cases beyond just mine. The investigation into his professional conduct revealed that he had been accepting payments from Helena and other wealthy clients to provide predetermined psychological evaluations. The breakthrough moment came when Detective Santos executed search warrants on Helena's home and office, seizing computers and financial records that provided definitive proof of her various fraud schemes. The forensic computer analysis revealed email communications where Helena discussed her plans to neutralize me and previous victims, as well as detailed instructions to her network of accomplices about how to coordinate their false testimony. But the most damaging evidence came from Helena's own security cameras, which she had installed throughout her property to monitor visitors and staff. The cameras had inadvertently recorded Helena coaching Ashley on what to say about me, practicing her own performance for the soup incident, and celebrating with her accomplices after each successful phase of her campaign against me. Helena's response to these investigations was exactly what Dr. Mitchell had predicted. She became increasingly desperate and reckless, making the kinds of obvious mistakes that exposed her to even more serious charges. When faced with evidence of her financial crimes, she attempted to bribe investigating officers. When confronted with proof of her manufactured evidence against me, she tried to intimidate witnesses by threatening their families. Each new crime added to her eventual sentence and further demonstrated the criminal mindset that David had been trained to ignore. The moment I had been waiting for came when David was finally forced to confront irrefutable evidence of Helena's manipulation. A video recording from Helena's own security system showed her teaching Ashley how to fake tears while reporting my alleged threats, followed by Helena's gleeful laughter as she discussed how easy it had been to fool David into believing his mother was dangerous. When Detective Santos showed David this footage, along with the voice analysis proving the threatening messages were manufactured and the financial records showing Helena had stolen from his wife's trust fund, I watched through a one-way window as my son's world collapsed. The man who had spent months defending Helena against my paranoid accusations was forced to confront the fact that every terrible thing I had said about her was actually an understatement of her cruelty. David's reaction was everything I had hoped for and everything I had dreaded. He broke down completely, sobbing as he realized that he had not only failed to protect his mother from a vicious attack, but had actively participated in my persecution based on lies. The son who had told police that I was violent and unstable now understood that he had been the weapon Helena used to inflict the deepest wounds. Helena's arrest was conducted with the kind of media attention that she had always craved but never wanted. News crews captured footage of the woman who had terrorized multiple families being led away in handcuffs, charged with enough felonies to ensure she would spend the rest of her life in prison. The story became a sensation because it revealed how easily intelligent, loving family members could be manipulated into destroying their own relationships. The final phase of our plan involved David's complete understanding of what Helena had stolen from our family. Linda presented him with a detailed timeline showing how each of Helena's lies had been designed to drive a wedge between us, and how his own responses had been predicted and planned for by a woman who studied human psychology to exploit people's deepest vulnerabilities. But my greatest victory wasn't Helena's imprisonment or the financial settlement that restored my security. It was the moment when David looked at me with clear eyes and said, "Mom, I don't know how to forgive myself for what I've done to you." For the first time in over a year, my son was seeing me as a person who had been wronged rather than a problem that needed to be managed. Helena Westbrook was ultimately sentenced to 14 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to 17 felony charges including wire fraud, conspiracy, elder abuse, and obstruction of justice. The judge's comments during sentencing reflected the court's horror at the sophisticated nature of her crimes and the devastating impact on multiple families. Additional charges are pending in 3 other states, which means Helena will likely spend the rest of her life incarcerated. But my story isn't really about Helena's punishment, it's about what I learned about myself and about the relationships that matter most in life. The woman who sat in that emergency room with burns on her face was broken, defeated, and convinced that she had failed at the most important job of her life, being a good mother. The woman writing this story today is someone entirely different, someone who discovered strength she never knew she possessed and wisdom she could only gain through surviving the worst betrayal imaginable. David's journey back to understanding took months of painful conversations, family therapy, and his own reckoning with how completely he had been manipulated. The hardest part for him wasn't accepting that Helena had lied about me. It was confronting how readily he had believed those lies because they confirmed his own unconscious resentments about the sacrifices I had made for his success. Helena had exploited the guilt David felt about my struggles as a single mother by convincing him that distancing himself from me was actually a form of kindness. I would love to tell you that forgiveness came easily and that our relationship was immediately restored to what it had been before, but that wouldn't be honest. The truth is that David's betrayal had revealed fundamental problems in our relationship that existed long before Helena came along. I had raised him to be successful and independent, but I had also taught him that my needs and feelings were less important than his comfort and happiness. Helena had simply exploited a dynamic I had created by never teaching David that love requires mutual respect and consideration. Recovery required establishing entirely new boundaries and expectations that protected both of us from falling back into unhealthy patterns. I told David that I loved him unconditionally, but that rebuilding our relationship would require him to demonstrate through actions, not just words, that he understood the magnitude of what had happened and was committed to ensuring it never happened again. My conditions for reconciliation were non-negotiable. David had to complete 6 months of individual therapy focused on understanding how he had been manipulated and why he had been vulnerable to Helena's tactics. He had to write detailed apology letters to Patricia Hendricks and Ellen Morrison, acknowledging his role in perpetuating the system that had victimized them. Most importantly, he had to accept that his relationship with Ashley needed to change fundamentally if our family was going to heal. Ashley's situation was complicated because she had been as much a victim of Helena's manipulation as anyone else, but she had also participated in my persecution in ways that couldn't be ignored. She had lied to investigators, supported the fraudulent restraining order, and helped Helena create the false narrative that portrayed me as dangerous. Ashley needed her own therapy and her own process of making amends, separate from whatever David chose to do. The financial settlement from Helena's insurance companies and the recovery of Ashley's stolen trust fund provided resources for healing that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. I used part of my settlement to establish the Thompson Foundation for Family Justice, an organization dedicated to helping other families who had been torn apart by manipulation and fraud. Patricia, Ellen, and I became advocates for legal reforms that would make it harder for people like Helena to abuse the court system. My work with the foundation taught me that our case wasn't unique or even particularly unusual. Every month, we received calls from families dealing with sophisticated manipulation campaigns, usually involving someone with resources and connections who had learned to use legal and medical systems as weapons against vulnerable relatives. The foundation provided legal support, connected victims with appropriate professionals, and worked to educate judges and attorneys about these complex abuse patterns. But perhaps the most important lesson I learned was about the difference between loving someone and enabling them to mistreat you. For years, I had confused unconditional love with unconditional acceptance of poor behavior. I had taught David that being a good mother meant absorbing whatever treatment he chose to give me, and that my role was to support his choices regardless of how those choices affected me. True love, I discovered, sometimes requires setting boundaries that the other person doesn't want to accept. It means refusing to participate in relationships that diminish your worth or compromise your integrity, even when that refusal causes pain to someone you care about deeply. It means understanding that you cannot save someone from the consequences of their choices, and that trying to do so often prevents them from learning and growing. My relationship with baby Emma, now a toddler who calls me Grandma Maggie, has become a source of pure joy that I almost lost forever. But even that relationship operates within carefully maintained boundaries that protect all of us from repeating past patterns. I see Emma regularly, but I no longer sacrifice my own needs or compromise my principles to maintain that access. Emma is learning that families can be loving and supportive while still respecting everyone's individual dignity and autonomy. David and I have rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than guilt and obligation. He no longer expects me to be endlessly accommodating of his needs, and I no longer define my worth based on his approval or success. We love each other, but we also recognize that love alone isn't enough to sustain healthy relationships without honesty, communication, and the willingness to prioritize each other's well-being over our own comfort. The scars from Helena's campaign, both physical and emotional, serve as permanent reminders of how close I came to losing everything that mattered to me. But they also remind me of my own strength and the support system I built during the darkest period of my life. Linda Chen remains one of my closest friends, and Dr. Mitchell has become a mentor in my advocacy work. These relationships, forged in crisis, have proven more durable and meaningful than many I had before this ordeal began. I often think about what would have happened if I had accepted Helena's demands and quietly disappeared from David's life, as she initially wanted me to do. She would have continued her pattern of manipulation and abuse with other families, Ashley would never have discovered the theft of her inheritance, and David would have lived his entire life believing his mother was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone's destructive behavior, even when that refusal causes immediate pain to everyone involved. To anyone who recognizes their own story and mine, I want you to understand that you are not responsible for other people's choices to believe lies about you, and you are not required to accept mistreatment in the name of keeping peace or preserving relationships. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their poor choices and allow them to face the natural consequences of their behavior. What happened to me could happen to anyone, because sophisticated manipulators like Helena understand human psychology and know exactly which emotional buttons to push to achieve their goals. But the same strength that helps you survive such an ordeal can be redirected toward building something better than what you lost. I am not the same person I was before Helena entered my life, and while I wouldn't choose to repeat that experience, I am grateful for the wisdom and strength it ultimately provided. The woman who raised David to be successful and independent was loving but passive, someone who defined her worth through other people's achievements and happiness. The woman I am today is someone who understands that her own dignity and well-being matter, and that truly loving relationships require mutuality and respect from all participants. I learned that being a good mother doesn't mean accepting whatever treatment your child chooses to give you, and that sometimes the most important lesson you can teach is how to treat others with dignity and kindness. My story ends with the understanding that some relationships can be rebuilt stronger than they were before, but only if everyone involved is willing to do the hard work of change and growth. Not every family survives what we survived, and not every story has the resolution mine did. But every person deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their role in someone else's life, and sometimes defending that principle requires courage that you never knew you possessed. I hope that sharing my experience helps other families recognize the warning signs of manipulation and understand that they have options beyond simply enduring abuse in the name of family loyalty. More importantly, I hope it encourages people to examine their own relationships and consider whether they are built on foundations of mutual respect or patterns of enabling and control that ultimately serve no one's best interests. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between keeping peace and defending your own dignity? How did you handle family members who consistently chose to believe the worst about you instead of giving you the benefit of the doubt? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations help all of us learn and grow from each other's experiences. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to help other people find it, and subscribe for more stories about resilience, justice, and the complicated dynamics of family relationships. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they're not alone in dealing with toxic family situations, and that it's possible to rebuild your life even after the worst betrayal imaginable. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you the strength to demand the respect and love you deserve in all of your relationships. Remember, being a good family member never requires you to accept abuse, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when it costs you something precious in the short term.